Thank you so much, Anthony, and very impressive to see that still so many are with us at the end of the second day here. So good afternoon and a very warm welcome to the session on foresight and governance. We actually, in many ways, started this conversation already yesterday, but I think it's very important to continue it today. So foresight is, of course, not about a single session or a single panel. It's very much a process that we need to keep investing in. And it is something that needs to really become, I believe, part and parcel of our mindset, of how we do things, and how we really have the courage to challenge conventional wisdom, or as Jeff Mulgan put it yesterday, to challenge the zombie orthodoxies. Now, yesterday we heard mostly the insights and experiences from an institutional perspective. So for those of you who were with us yesterday, you remember we had colleagues from the EBRD and from NATO. We also had very much perspective from academia. But today is really an opportunity perhaps to zero in on how foresight is done at the national level. And for that, let me now immediately turn to Pierre Bollinger, Head of Research, Partnership and International Affairs at France Stratégie. And Pierre, under your excellent leadership of your director, Jean Pisani-Ferry, your institution is, of course, of great importance in France. So perhaps you speak to us a little bit about how you do foresight and what insights you'd like to share with us today. I need to say, before I hand over, I have asked my panel to keep their remarks to about 7 minutes each. So I'm counting on you to help me look at the clock. And with that, over to you, Pierre.
Okay, thank you so much, Anne. It's a pleasure to be here and honored to be here. There are two ways to answer the question you are asking in this panel that was mentioned already yesterday. Some panelists say, we know what to do, but how do we get the foresight perspective to the decision makers? That's one way to put the question. Another way to put the question is more structural and systemic in some ways. It is to say, how can decision makers and how can governance take more in account mid and long-term perspectives? And one probably overlaps the other, but probably the responses and the answers to each of these questions are different. So I'm going to try to do a sort of artistic mix of both. Let me say first as a disclaimer that in France Stratégie, we don't do foresight in a hardcore sense, in some ways. We do rarely scenarios. What we do is more that we consider current problems within the lens of the mid to long-term perspective. And we consider mid to long-term problems in a way within the lens of immediate action that needs to be taken. So it leads us to treat a number of topics that are classical topics for professionals' foresight: climate change, biodiversity, debt, growth, migration, and so on. And definitely some of them are really, really important and critical to a policymaking process, since they're irreversible, right? And that after a certain time we reach a tipping point where it's not possible to get back. So basically we treat foresight in a way that makes us consider anything beyond the short term. So that's our definition of foresight, and probably my colleagues will have some quite different definitions. So it's a very loose definition of foresight. Let me start with a paradox in some ways. We could say that the very reasons why foresight approaches matter more than ever now are also the reason why it's difficult to have them translated within the policy-making process. I'll list a couple of bad news in some ways. That could be encompassed by the idea of short-termism. It was alluded to this morning. The first item would be the idea that the media system has changed and that there's so much stress put on events and urgency and emotions. And it's pretty tough for media to account for structural trends that are actually deeply rooted but deeply affecting society, the political sphere, and so on. And actually, maybe foresighters, they don't escape always the urge to give answers in an emergency situation. And yesterday, and even today, it was kind of possible to see, you know, the sort of anxiousness of people after the election, after the US presidential election, and some sort of pressure for practitioners of foresight to say what's going on first and what's going to happen. So there is some sort of media pressure that we cannot ignore. It's been underlined this morning. That's something important. Another thing important in short-termism is the political cycle. The professional of politics, politicians, they're submitted to cycles of election. They are accountable. And interestingly enough, very candidly, a well-known politician at the European level said, I think it said in French, but I will say it in English, we politicians, we very well know what should be done, but we just don't know how to do it to be re-elected if we do it.
That was my boss.
Right. So we have to take into account the constraints of politicians. And it's maybe probably too easy to enter into a blame game for a practitioner of foresight to say, oh, you didn't listen to us. Because politicians are submitted to cycles, submitted to democratic accountability, and basically they need to adjust different time frame. One time frame is a social time frame, and another time frame is the economic time frame, and the political time frame is different. So from this point of view, they have a pretty difficult job, and the quote from Mendès France is well known: "To govern is to foresee. Gouverner, c'est prévoir." Yes, but as it has been said yesterday and today, you know, politicians are under intense pressure to respond to emergencies. So how do you make this different time setting coincide together? It's something very important. Third, it has been said also previously, it's difficult for foresight, for midterm perspective, to enter the bureaucratic settings for two reasons. It's been underlined yesterday. Conformism, in some ways. A participant said, conformity that gets you to the top prevents you from understanding what's around you. It's pretty serious. But also the pressures of emergencies. You have to hand out to your boss, you know, within a very given time frame, responses to sometimes topics that are pretty hard to understand. So there is a pressure towards short term too. Finally, and that's relevant to the topic today, the transformation of governance. Already in 1961, a very well-known political scientist asked, who governs? Do you have more an answer today than we used to have in the 60s? We know that governance is multi-layered, that power is disseminated, and that's a problem for experts, but that's also a problem for citizens and voters. Because how do you know who you should sanction, since you don't know who is responsible for the decision? How can you have decision maker being responsible for the decision if the decisions are themselves the product of interaction between levels, European, national, regional, between institutions, parliament, commission, and so on. Now, unfortunately, you could say that also there are some bad news on the side of foresight. So let me list a few of them that probably explain why it's difficult to have foresight get into the mainstream of policy making. One is the issue of predictability. How much predictable are risks? There is a level of uncertainty that is sometimes pretty hard to assess on a scientific basis. Second, there is the issue of scientificity. How much of a science is foresight? How much based on values, recommendations, and sometimes recommendations based on political preferences are they? Are we able to evacuate, to dismiss these political preferences? Where do we go from there? I just want to offer a few suggestions. First, at the level of nuts and bolts of foresight, and second, at the more systemic level. A first suggestion would be to integrate even more foresight into the capacity building of expertise. Probably a practitioner of foresight shouldn't be insulated from the research in general. And the fact that in the Parliament there are close to the Global Trends Unit evaluation, ex-post and evaluation post-ante, and that they group together within the research survey is something important. Because they need to be accountable as to the evidence. I mean, the foresighters, they need to be accountable as to the evidence they're giving for their provisions and for the scenario they're making. Second, it's probably important that a clarification would be made about the status of the statements that are made. Are they based on evidence? Are they based on political correctness? Are they based on the idea that we agree on that? But who agrees on that? Trump supporters, the elites, who? You know, that's something important. And maybe my colleague will allude to it, in the making of foresight, the idea that you would steer the debate, you would play on collective intelligence, the idea that you wouldn't do foresight on your own, but that you open the way to produce, the way to make study is something very important. Third, probably an important thing is to resist the temptation to have an impact on policy making, to tell policymakers what they want to hear. It's not always that easy, right? Because there are expectations, and you have to meet expectations. And finally, there is a very difficult thing to do, which is probably not to substitute foresight to other levels of discussion, and especially the political level. Parties have a role to play, and they need to feed themselves with analysis that is given by practitioners of foresight. But one of their roles precisely is to put together sets of values, to aggregate interests and preferences. And probably practitioners of foresight should be cautious about not doing the same. Then, finally, just a couple of suggestions about systemic changes. What I mean by systemic changes is that these are changes that don't depend on practitioners of foresight. They were alluded to in the conference. Some of the remarks I think were really interesting. A first thing to do maybe would be for a policy-making organization to leave some space for reflection and criticism and innovation within them. That's an important thing. It was mentioned yesterday at length. Institution may encourage thinking out of the box, but we know that also they encourage thinking inside the box. And they shouldn't get too much outside of the box. Tout changer pour que rien ne change, right?
Yeah.
That's a danger. A second thing that is probably very important is education and socialization of leaders. Michael Ignatieff yesterday talked at length about that in a very interesting way, because in a very nuanced way, and showing how much to be a leader is almost an impossible task, because you have to gather contradictory skills. And finally, last remark, if we want mid-term to long-term perspective to be incorporated within governance, some institutions can play a big role beside the state. And these are NGOs, for instance. And no later than today, we see that coalitions of business and the corporate sector can have more than a say, but a weight. And that's especially the case for the Paris Agreement, which is under threats, to say the least. And one could argue that NGO and civil society and coalition can play the role of defending the mid to long-term perspective in front of policymakers that have to respond to urgency, and that's part of their role. I will limit myself to this latest remark.
Thank you so much, Pierre. As you were speaking, it occurred to me that sort of some of the implicit assumptions, and Angela will correct me if I'm wrong, that we're making about foresight is you bring some smart people together, they write a paper, you give it to a politician, and the politician will act on it. I think it has proven that this system doesn't work. It is very difficult for politicians to think about something that goes beyond their immediate electoral cycle, which prompted my boss to say what he did. But nonetheless, we have really, with no imagination whatsoever, thought about doing it differently. And maybe we can use this discussion to look at policy areas where change has been brought about, thinking about medium to long-term developments. In Europe, I can really only think of the area of climate change where this has worked. And it hasn't been because politicians have been so insightful. It's been mostly around advocacy at the grassroots level. So perhaps this is something, because I'm thinking now about governance and how you actually put this into practice. But enough from me. Our next guest joins us all the way from South Africa. My apologies, Marius Oosthuizen. Apologies for the terrible pronunciation, who serves on the faculty in Strategic Foresight at the Borden Institute of Business Science at the University of Pretoria. And Marius, it will be fascinating, I think, for us here in Europe to hear your insights of how this is done in South Africa. And I noted that you sit with, I think, a business school, right? So does that mean that that foresight primarily takes place there, or is it also used in public policy? So perhaps you can join the debate.
Thank you. I'd like to make three different sets of comments very briefly, but perhaps start by sharing two anecdotal examples of the use of foresight in South Africa. One, a gleaming example of success, and the other one of failure. And we could learn something from that. The first is an example referred to as the Montvleur scenarios. As you would know, in South Africa, we went from apartheid under a race-based regime to democracy with Nelson Mandela. What many people don't know is that foresight, at a very critical point in time, played an interesting role in facilitating that transformation. In the early 1990s, around 1992, a foresight practitioner got 22 leaders from across the political spectrum into a retreat center for a weekend, and they spent a few days locked away. We're talking people from the Communist Party, people from the Afrikaner Nationalist Party that ran the apartheid state, from across that political spectrum. And they spent a few days thinking about the trends, and we have it up here as the theme of the conference, global trends, thinking about the trends affecting the country. And then thinking about what those trends mean for the future. Of course, when you put people from different political persuasions in a room, they start off having an ideological debate. But when they look collectively at a set of trends that are factual, that can be measured, what begins to happen is they begin to form a shared picture of the past, of the present, and potentially of alternative futures that are possible. And so in this scenario process, they developed a set of scenarios for the country, one of which was where we have a negotiated settlement, where the economy in the country grows at about 3%, and they refer to this scenario as the flight of the flamingos. Flamingos are a beautiful pink bird that fly together in formation, and the vision was of this country with these divided communities flying together in formation. The second scenario was an ostrich scenario, where the government of the day sticks their head in the sand, we don't have a political settlement, and we have a civil war. after a few years of no economic growth or economic collapse. And the third scenario was a scenario called Icarus, where a new multiracial government comes into power. This government is communist and socialist, very populist, spends too rapidly, and creates a massive fiscal deficit. And the scenario was called Icarus because Icarus, of course, is this mythical creature that stuck wings to his back using wax, flew up to the sun, and the sun warmed the wax, and he fell to his death. And so the picture was of a nation that recovers from apartheid, but is destroyed very shortly afterwards. And what was interesting about these scenarios is they were picked up by some of the mainstream media. They were shared around the country. At one point, they were taken to Robben Island, and they were shared with Nelson Mandela. Of course, it's very difficult to measure what the ultimate impact was, but there is a consensus that they influence the elite in the country to understand that they have a set of political choices that entail concessions from across the political divide. So that's one example of foresight being used very effectively. The second is of foresight being used not as effectively by the current administration in the presidency, developing what they call the National Development Plan for South Africa for 2030. Cost a lot of money to produce. There were 60 commissioners involved from across the society, but very little uptake on the foresight that was produced. And the reason really at the heart of it is because the process did not take the population along in any real way. And this brings us to the question of this conference. As I've sat here for a couple of days listening to the discussion, the question in my mind has been, what is the problem that we're describing? And can foresight be used to address that problem? I think in my mind, the problem with the comments on inequality and all kinds of issues around populism comes down to, very simply, democracy without equality and fraternity. And a democracy that is liberal but without equality and fraternity is fundamentally democracy that is unsustainable. And so the question then becomes, from the examples I've given, can foresight be used as a means to govern in a way that brings the population along, that enables the population to contribute to the dialogue? And this brings me in my final comment to the way in which we're using foresight at the Business Institute where I'm positioned. We are an academic institute with the university. We are a business institute, but we understand that our role in our society involves engagement with government as well as civil society. And so what we do is we combine dialogue processes. Of course, dialogue is not the same as political consultation. A dialogue, to be effective, requires equal partners in creative conversation. So we combine dialogue processes with multiple stakeholders from government, business, and civil society, with a foresight process that allows them to grapple with the future together. And of course, the assumption is that in the process of grappling with the future, those stakeholders develop social capital. And then the final piece of the puzzle is this idea of advocacy that was mentioned. In the process of doing foresight, we of course have the opportunity to introduce our values, to say, well, if this is the future that we project as being a probable future, is that the future we want? And if not, what do we do in terms of engagement in the present to produce an alternative future? And I hope that gives you a window into some of the work we do. We of course can unpack that further in our discussion.
You used a remarkable example. I can't think of an equivalent here in Europe, but I think the role of the citizen, because I think a lot of what we do is very paternalistic. You know, these politicians who may have access to the foresight, but somehow can't act on it. I think understanding how we use the governance to better inform citizens about the choices that are to be made for the future, I think is very important. And I am so glad that I can now call on Angela Wilkinson, a former head of strategic foresight at the OECD and author of Strategic Reframing, to help me pull all of this together the entire last 2 days. But Angela, foresight and governance, what comes to your mind? And as I said, you've been with us from the beginning. Help us intellectually to sort of bring it together and perhaps also chart a little bit a path forward for foresight in general, but ESPAS in particular, in 7 minutes.
in 7 minutes. I'm going to try. All right, I'm going to start with where I think the conversations have gone in the last few days and try and see if I can bring that back down to a foresight perspective. And also add something around why I like working with foresight and reflect on some of the challenges, because the challenges are both with others who aren't foresight literate, but also from within the community itself about what it thinks it's doing. But first of all, yesterday was a fascinating series of panels talking about trends. And from a foresight perspective, and no disrespect at all to people who work with evidence and quantification, just to qualify, I'm a PhD theoretical physicist. Modeling is my life. It's just there's different types of models. Right, but for foresight, trends are the remains of yesterday's futures. To find the futures that are alive in the present, you have to look just beyond the trends. The other second part of trend-based analysis, which comes from a tradition of thinking about the future, which we might call a forecasting, a linear way of thinking about the future, is that when we're doing a trend analysis, in effect, we're walking into the future backwards. We're looking at where we've come from, and we're extending that, right? So that's the tools that we largely use in rational decision-making. We focus on what could be common to everybody. This is an objective analysis, that's what it means. It's abstracted, and we also do it, we're in effect we're driving by looking in the rearview mirror. But we're not thinking about how the road ahead is being created, right? So if we want to know where the road ahead's being created, we might go into the political sphere, and we might think about values and norms and visions. And the challenges that we faced is that societies have become tired of leaders who make promises but don't deliver them. So there's been an exhaustion of what I would call grand visioning, of big promises not delivered. And so we find ourselves in this paradoxical time of futures present, where we know that there's a trap in forecasting the future because inherently there's uncertainty and ambiguity. And that ambiguity comes from social and political diversity, right? And yet at the same time, we know that we can't rely on utopian idealism because it's proved to be useless. So how do we navigate between these facts of the past and these visions of the future? And that's what foresight tries to do. It tries to open up a space for the future in the present. And it's the equivalent of breathing and paying attention to breathing, right? It's not something that somebody does for you. We all do it all the time. But in foresight, we say the future isn't empty. It's not an information transmission problem. It's not that here I am, a foresight practitioner full of knowledge, and you're the empty-headed decision maker, and I'll just transfer my knowledge to you, right? That's not the deal. We're trying to open up a bandwidth, an exchange. And the bandwidth is as important for the guys who work with the hard evidence as it is for the guys who are working with the norms and values, because it allows an exchange and it allows a conversation, and it does that by not working only with the facts. It works by trying to reveal, test, and safely contest assumptions, right? And so it has a respectable quality to bring, and everybody can get to finding the assumptions. If there is a strategy, there is an assumption about the future that strategy will need to work. There are assumptions about the future. The question is, are they realistic? Are they the only assumptions we could be making? If they're not the only assumptions, then we're in the world of scenario planning, of alternative futures that could happen. But that's very different to the futures we would like to happen, which is the normative future. So in foresight, we work with a future that's predictable, probabilistic. We work with a future which is preferable, and we work with a future that's plausible. And we do that by challenging this contest between long and short term, by trying to open up the future. We say there's different time horizons. There's not just one. It's not just a linear discounting analysis that we're doing. We're trying to work out what should people pay attention to. How do they make choices? And we do that by revealing and testing and contesting assumptions. So yesterday was all full of trends. Today was full of actors. And in foresight, we say that Actors see trends, right? And they discuss them, but there's no what do they say? There's no God-given position in a system that allows you to see all the trends on behalf of every other perspective in the system. So in Foresight, we're attentive to who's looking at the trends and why. What trends do they see, and do they see the only trends? We're also looking at whether they're not paying attention to the trends that are being seen and why. So the whole point is it's not to be right about the future. Foresight tries to create, in effect, a set of maps. Maps, if you've ever thought about them, are always temporary, they're structured for a purpose, they're useful, but they're always wrong. So the job of Foresight is not to get the future right. The job of Foresight is to help us see where we stand in the present by making sure we reveal and test those assumptions. And I think there's a big misunderstanding of that in general in these areas. So yesterday we went on a tour de force of trends, global trends. And I spent 3.5 years at the OECD. We have a challenge. Global foresight is in its infancy. When we say global, what do we mean? Do we mean overarching to all the member states, or do we mean truly global? If we went to China, would they think that we had the same trends as them? And when we talk about the different actors, did we include all the actors or just some of the actors? So the job of Foresight is to bring these actors and factors together. And it does that by saying there's more than one strategic context. There's the space in which we act, and there's always a space beyond that. And strategy has to be not just about what we want to do, but whether we can do it in the context that presents itself. So let me stop there.
Okay, very good. Thank you. Thank you so much, Angela, also for, at the very end, tell us how you really do foresight, which is extremely useful. But give me one example of where this actually works, because I understand the different futures, but how does it ever translate into concrete action?
The the Association of Gastrologists worldwide. Well, they could be policymakers, right? But it's a certain professional community. Mm-hmm. These are the experts. Where do experts like to live? They like to live in a quadrant which is called comfortable and familiar. Where do leaders make their value? They make it in a quadrant which we might call unfamiliar but comfortable. So if we confuse experts and leaders, we have a problem. Leaders are going to move us somewhere else, to something different. So this group of gastronomists, they're the best in their field, have a problem. They don't know how to think about their future. So they come and they ask, we need to make sure we're thinking about our future in the right way. So we work with them. We lay out all their assumptions. They're making lots of assumptions about things they know about. They're making no assumptions about everything else they're taking for granted. And one of those assumptions, this is gastrologists. These people study stomachs. What are they not looking at? Food and diet. Why aren't they looking at food and diet? Because they have no expertise in food and diet. Why is it difficult to look at food and diet? Because it makes them non-experts, and that's uncomfortable. And so you have to have a process that takes them from familiar and comfortable to unfamiliar but comfortable. And through that process, they have to engage with uncertainty and ignorance. And we have to have a process that allows them to move from what they know to letting go of everything that they know, to working back to knowing more but being comfortable with less familiar things. And the challenge of technocracy is, this morning I heard a very interesting presentation, which wasn't a rage against, as I understood it, it wasn't really, the evidence base, should we get rid of it? It wasn't about that, but it's attending to the fact that when we start working with the evidence base, there's always been something that's framed it already. And we should think carefully as much about the framing as we should about the quality of the evidence. And foresight helps us more with the quality of judgment and framing than it does about decision outcomes.
I mean, what I hear from you, and also throughout the 2 days, a lot of it is creating a comfort zone, whether it be for experts or for politicians, to learn about new areas or new disciplines, right? Because it's this feeling of uncomfortness that if we don't understand, we don't really want to deal with it. So thank you. I'm starting to really understand better around the governance and how to do it. But let's go to the floor if there are any questions, comments.
to the question I would have to the panel, is we might need a new social contract. So to communicate practically with the civil society, actually. I don't think that it's a lack of interest at the level of politicians in foresight. What it is actually a lack of communication to the public. The reason the Montfleury scenarios was so successful, all due respect to the workshop, was actually that the media picked it up and the population was at the side, and then it was pressure over the political system. And mentioned a little bit the role of the public. I think what we need more now than educating the politicians in foresight, we actually need to develop a foresight literacy of the population at large. Because if the population puts pressure, exactly as you mentioned, climate change was a successful story, and the Montreal Protocol was a successful story, and many other successful stories like that. Environmental security got put on the political and security agenda because the population understood and the population expected the politicians to take action. So what I think we should do, and that's the question to you, how do you think foresight teaching, vision, can be introduced from very early ages? Because we teach them history, the young people, but we don't teach them vision. We don't teach them what they should expect from the future. And when it gets introduced into studying at master's program, it's too late, and there are too few who understand that. They should grow up in this extraordinary fast-paced age, era. They should grow up with it, and then they will put the pressure on politicians, and your job will be a piece of cake.
Very nice. The colleague from the Swedish Foreign Ministry here, I hope I got that right, the lady here in...
Thank you. Katarina Engberg, Prime Minister's Office.
Oh, okay. Apologies.
It is my experience from working with the politicians in strategic planning, strategic foresight, that in most cases they are very grateful to have this opportunity just to sit down and reflect, detached from the operational concerns. And they are, your role then as a civil servant is to present them with description of alternative future developments that are of relevance for the stakeholder, and discuss possible consequences for the stakeholders of these alternative futures. So it really ties into what our South African friend was describing. It's a sort of conversation. You help them get the space and time to
Can I
reflect.
ask you something? Because Sweden had a minister for the future. How did that work?
Well, that is, and I was going to my next point. The next sequence of this is that you should stop short of policy prescriptions, because that will be the responsibility for individual ministers, and then you get into budgetary concerns, and this is something that can only be discussed and resolved on the level of the whole of the government and under the leadership of the Prime Minister. And I think that was one of the problems in pursuing that effort on the side of the Swedish government. Also, one should underline that this is in the midst of the term of the current government, where it came in with an open mind towards discussing future issues, but then was overwhelmed by the refugee inflow and had to turn all its attention to integrating the 160,000 people that came in within a few months to a country of 9.7 million citizens. So it's now in a more of survival mode, and we have elections in 2 years' time. So that's also a question of the window of opportunity you have with regard to governments.
No, but also an interesting insight that foresight is perhaps easier when you don't have huge immediate crisis, because you get more face time with your political leaders. Okay, we take one more. I'm sorry, I'm going to just discriminate in favor of women today. There is a lovely lady right next to you. Please stand up and introduce yourself.
My name is Sylvia Schmidt. I'm from the Environmental Ministry in North Rhine-Westphalia, Germany. and we just installed a Foresight unit, of which I'm part. We're 2 people. We have a 500 people ministry. And I would just like to ask the panelists if you have any ideas on how to overcome this huge resistance we're faced with when we want to introduce methods like scenario workshops. And this is, in my experience, just very much against this traditional administrative culture that at least we in Germany still have. So I would be really thankful for some insights from you.
Very good. I think we'll need to leave it here because I see that Klaus Welle is already with us, so we don't want to run way over time. But what I suggest is that we go back to all of the speakers for perhaps 1.5 minutes. And in addition to answering all the questions you heard, that maybe you give us a parting thought. Just what, at the end of these 2 days, what do you want to leave with us? Yeah.
Well, that's a tough, really, really tough question. Well, I underline a few obstacles, but basically the idea was to take them into account, so that we can offer some reasonable solution. To answer the question of this lady, I think socialization is something really important, and I take out what Michael Ignatieff said about the socialization of leaders and especially politicians, and that sensitivity to not only practitioners of foresight, but also to academia as such. There are, in many countries, including France, still a big gap, a big divide between academia and policymaking, for instance. They don't speak the same language, their expectations are not the same, and everything that can contribute to actually to bridge these worlds seem to be welcome to me.
Excellent. Very good. Thank you so much. Marius.
I think if I can extract a couple of strands from the discussion over the last 2 days, as you've grappled with what can be done, I think a key point to make is around institutional reform. There's been a lot said about the idea of becoming more participative, and I think from a foresight perspective, more participation in political processes certainly is an aspect of what would be required. I think the second key strain was around becoming more local, allowing people in the grassroots to have a contribution to the process. And I think those two, participation with localization on different issues, I think certainly are key. To respond to the question around education, I agree 100% that that's critical to introduce that. One view is to say that foresight, similar to hindsight, is in fact an instinctive capability that we have as human beings. The propensity is that we hand over our capacity for foresight to our fears. And I think a lot of what we heard this last 2 days was around, these are the trends, they're all exogenous, beyond our control, and this is the looming future. And I think a parting thought might be that we can also be intentional about the future, not in a fearful way, but in the frame of hope, to say, what are the aspirations we have, and what can we do to create those?
Excellent. Thank you so much. Angela.
I'd agree with that. I think there was what I would call the presentism bias, though, even in our meeting. Populism, 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 populism. I mean, there are other things that are happening in the world that Europe needs to be engaged with. And so the challenge is how do we avoid evidence-constrained pessimism and useless utopianism? But, you know, at some point at this time, somebody needs to be able to give a narrative of hope, and the evidence needs to be brought to bear to realize it.
Excellent. Thank you so much also for being so disciplined. Perhaps I take a minute as chair to tell you a little bit what I learned. I learned that it's very important to involve stakeholders and the public, including at the local level. That I think the foresight is too elitist. It is for a handful of experts, but it's not mainstreamed at all, and certainly not sort of at the level of the population. I learned that it is a process, not an event. I think too often we say, we have a great workshop, or even yesterday, and people write to me, great day. So what? I mean, is this Europe's problem that we haven't had enough conferences? You know, so I mean, it is, you know, it's not an event. It is something that we must internalize and actually do, you know. And I also learned it's about safe spaces. It's about taking people out of their comfort zone, but creating a safe space where they can learn about the future. And this is something that we very much try to do with the EPSC at the European Commission. I always say it's not about our papers, it's not about our events. It's about being a space where people can come and just talk and think without all the usual constraints. And I think that the actual space is very important. I fought tooth and nail to get a meeting room without one of these awful big tables, you know, that you can't move around, where you have just, chairs that you can arrange in any way that you want. It sounds stupid, but it's not, you know. The other advice I would have is don't do it in a very formal way. Do it in the evening, over dinner, serve a glass of wine, relax people, you know, and then start talking about it. We did it last night at our dinner, works beautifully, almost every time. Then I learned it is about facilitation. You need someone in the room who has the capability to get a real discussion going and to sustain that and have an element of honesty. I always preface everything at the EPSC by saying, at the EPSC, there are no intellectual no-go areas. And I always encourage everyone who comes to speak to us to speak from the heart and to say it as it is. Does it do wonders? I don't know. But it's certainly different, and it creates demand for more. And I think being that space where you can do these kinds of things is very important. I also learned it's very important not to have policy prescriptions. I think too often experts go in and just frankly bore everyone with what they think needs to happen. And this doesn't work with politicians. They want options. They want, they want you to facilitate a process where they can imagine the different futures. So that's hard on experts, I know, but I thought that was a really good insight. Lastly, I love the idea of not just teaching history, but teaching visions, teaching aspirations for the future. I think that's wonderful, and I think also a very good way to conclude this session. I hope we were able to bring it together a little bit at the end of these very exciting and fruitful 2 days and make it a little bit tangible of what we are talking about. I can now only ask to give a very warm round of applause to our excellent panel.